Two countries long bound by common arrangements are now facing the possible stormy waters of a no-deal Brexit. In Dublin port, there are preparations to treat the Irish Sea as a fully fledged international border. A decision made all the more likely now Boris Johnson has made clear where he'd like to end up, in a relationship less close to the EU than Theresa May wanted.
So the destination of a Canada-style free trade agreement, fine, theoretically, but of course a Canada-style FTA wouldn't solve the border question, so it would necessitate the continued existence of the backstop from the EU point of view, and so it's not a solution.
At Dublin's port, they've assumed the worst and started acting on that assumption 2 years ago, launching a programme of investment to build new customs and inspection facilities. They assumed Britain would be outside the single market and customs union and planned accordingly.
We decided we would take the British government at face value. We're not involved in the political discussions. We decided that we need to prepare here in Dublin Port for the effects of a hard Brexit. The reason we did that was the lead time to provide the infrastructure necessary if there was going to be a hard Brexit. That lead time meant we had to start early, maybe sooner than Ireland generally was thinking about such an eventuality.
But of course the port can plan and build infrastructure, doing precisely what both governments have pledged not to do on the Northern Ireland land border. This morning, Boris Johnson came here trying to convince the Irish government that the British government has answers to the challenges and that they're negotiating in earnest.
I want to get a deal. Like you, I've looked carefully at no deal. I've assessed its consequences both for our country and yours. And yes, of course, we could do it. The UK could certainly get through it. But be in no doubt, that outcome would be a failure of statecraft for which we would all be responsible.
His host, though, wanted to make clear that leaving the EU without a deal was no solution at all.
And whatever happens, we'll have to get back to the negotiating table quite quickly. And when we do, the first items on the agenda will be citizens' rights, the financial settlement and the Irish border.
Their talks were described as cordial, but nobody doubts that Mr Johnson has reached the time for hard political choices. Well, there's no denying that Boris Johnson wants to make progress on this visit, but also that he's very limited in his political room for manoeuvre. And really he's only got one of two ways he can go. In terms of the alternative arrangements, trying to separate out the hard border issues and make them more palatable, or to have a border on the Irish Sea, which of course would bring him into conflict with the DUP in the north, and could only really be resolved by him winning a thumping Conservative majority in a new election and not needing the DUP anymore. The DUP leader reminded us today that Mr Johnson has previously said he opposes a Northern Ireland-only backstop. From the Republic's perspective, though, keeping Northern Ireland bound into EU regulations and tariffs is now looking like the only viable option.
I think the expectation on this side of the Irish Sea is that if there is to be a deal, it'll be very much based around a Northern Ireland only backstop. That already was deemed acceptable to the EU and to the Irish government back in December 2017. It was the original solution which Theresa May had on the table, but then obviously it was rejected by the DUP and others, it has to be said, from the unionist community in Northern Ireland. So I think that if there is optimism, it's based on that, but obviously there's no guarantee that that can be an outcome between now and the 31st of October.
The new infrastructure for inspecting goods arriving from Britain is now in place in Dublin Port, and it's already being used. And it's precisely because such facilities cannot be replicated on the land border that Northern Ireland may end up permanently in the backstop, even if the rest of the UK doesn't.